Hi, Savannah.
Hi, Ryan.
What are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about Persepolis, the graphic novel and the movie. All right, well, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us on this lovely Tuesday. Just like last week, we want to invite you to stick around to the end of this episode where we will be talking all about our Pokemon card giveaway. So stay tuned for that very important message at the end.
And thank you to our anonymous sponsor, as well as we are interested in hosting other sponsors. So if you want, feel free to reach out to us. Our email is in the doobly-doo, links below. Thank you.
For this episode, this is a little Women's History Month special. You may have seen on our Instagram this month that in our stories we've been highlighting some of our favorite women who are activists and creators in all different mediums. So we have those up in our highlights still if you're interested in seeing maybe some of the people that we find to be particularly inspirational. We do think it's important to celebrate Women's History Month as Ryan and I are both women. And I think both of us, at least for me, I know I've been inspired by many of the women in my life, and I wouldn't be the person that I am without all of the support that I have from them. And right now, particularly, it is very important to continue highlighting the work of women as well as the struggles that women continue to face within all patriarchal societies, especially with things recently, such as the murder of Sarah Everand, the recent terrorist attack against Asian women, and the continued need to seek justice for Breonna Taylor. So it's really important now more than ever to continue talking about these things. So with that, Ryan, I'm kind of interested to know who is a woman that you feel particularly inspired by or is one of your icons?
You know, my heart was ripped out in 2021. The easy answer to that always 100% of the time whenever I was asked, it was J.K. Rowling, but with her being branded and living up to the brand as a TERF, I can no longer support her as an individual and as a person. It's a whole different conversation about the work itself, but it's really hard for me. It's actually been quite disheartening and sad because I considered Harry Potter to be such a huge part of my identity, and I'm still really grappling with that. And you know what? I used to also be a huge Adichie fan, Charmanda Adichie, who also turned out to be kind of a transphobic figure herself. So I just I feel burned, and I just want it to be said that even though they are very, very, very problematic women, not all narratives are super clean, and I'm just still struggling myself, so if you're like me, I'm sorry. It sucks.
I think there's probably a lot of people in your same boat, Ryan, feeling that way about J.K. Rowling. One of my favorite women icons that I am inspired by is Dolores Huerta, who I did highlight in our Instagram stories. She is an activist. She's 90 years old and is still an activist today. She originally started her work with Cesar Chavez with the United Farm Workers movement, and she's actually the person who coined the term si se puede that people still use today, and a lot of people misattribute that to Cesar Chavez. So I like to talk about Dolores Huerta anytime that I get to tell people about that, and she still, like I said, was like knocking on doors during the election at 90 years old and is very prolific, and there's really great documentary about her. So she's my icon.
I didn't know that she coined that term. I always thought it was Cesar Chavez.
Exactly. More people need to know the truth. Also, along with Women's History Month, we will be leaving some links in our description box of some women-led organizations and organizations that help women globally in all different capacities. So make sure you check those out in our description to help those people out. All right, so a little bit of background on Persepolis. It was originally a French comic series that was written and illustrated by Marjane Satrapi. And the first iteration of it came out in 2000, and the second iteration came out in 2004. The first iteration being titled The Story of a Childhood, and the second titled The Story of a Return. This comic series has been translated into numerous languages. I believe I saw somewhere between like 17 and 18 different languages, and it has sold more than 2 million copies worldwide as of 2018. It has received quite a bit of critical success. In 2019, it was ranked 47th on the Guardian's list of 100 best books of the 21st century, which is pretty impressive. And it has also been the point of controversy in some cases. It's used sometimes in classrooms here in the United States, like high school classes as well as college classes. And it has been frequently contested by like parents. People don't want it being taught in schools. And in 2014, it was listed as one of the top 10 most challenged books by the American Library Association. And in 2007, it was adapted into an animated film with a screenplay written by Marjane Satrapi again, and it was directed by her as well as Vincent Perronneau. This film was co-produced by both a French and Iranian company, and it won the jury prize in 2007 at the Cannes Film Festival. It was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Animated Film, but it lost out to Ratatouille that year.
I kind of want to talk about that just real quick off to the side. Do you think that was deservingly so?
No. I don't.
I think Ratatouille is a masterpiece, and I think it deserved the Academy Award. I'm going to stand by that right now.
Anyways, apart from all this critical success that Persepolis as a whole commodity has achieved, in the background, it has remained banned in Iran. This is a story about Iran, which we'll obviously get more into, but it has been banned, both the comics and the movie in Iran. And the author, Marjane Satrapi, she has essentially been living in exile from Iran for fear of going back, what might happen to her, essentially, for speaking out in this way.
So yeah, getting into my just general knowledge of Persepolis, I can remember seeing it in bookstores, and I mean, I'm pretty sure I saw it in the graphic novel section, and I thought it was a book about, like, a goth, just like a goth, and that's it. And, you know, I kind of was, like, right in a way when I read it. I felt a little bit satisfied. I felt like I was coming full circle. But having read it now, man, I wish I would have read this in a classroom. It's totally deserving of any classroom recognition and would have opened up my world just a lot more when I really needed it back then. And I still need it now. How about you, Savanah? How did you come across this form of media?
I similarly recall seeing Persepolis like at bookstores, but never really picked it up. I've never have necessarily like read a lot of graphic novels to begin with. I don't really know why. I have always enjoyed like the comics and graphic novels that I have read. I just, for whatever reason, haven't picked up a lot of them, but I'd like to pick up more of them. But I finally got around to reading this book when I was in graduate school. I particularly took a class that was on memoirs of stories of people who were from the Middle East or from Arab countries, and Persepolis was one of the ones that we read / watched the movie of. And I really fell in love with the story. Ended up doing my like final project in my class about Persepolis, and yeah, so that was my introduction with it. Ryan, I know that you've read quite a few more like graphic novels and comics than I have. What is your like general feelings with that medium, or like what is your connection to that medium?
I mean, I consider them to be books. I would just put them in the book category, to be honest. They're on Goodreads, and I rank them along with my reads for the current year. And what really draws me to a graphic novel is generally the art style, if it's really eye-catching. And I am one to buy books based off the cover. So if I do see a graphic novel that's recommended to me in BookTube and has a really graphic, eye-catching cover, I will likely pick it up. At least in my prime reading years. Now I'm a little bit more discerning about what graphic novels I pick up, and I have like a series that I've been following for a while, like Saga or Paper Girls or Lumberjanes, Nimona, the popular ones that I just continually pick up.
I am also a sucker for buying graphic novels or comics just based off the comic art, even though, like I said, I haven't read very many. I own quite a few that I have not read, but I bought them because I was really drawn in by the artwork. So I do have a library that I'd like to start reading from.
And you know, it's usually a good bet because I think to get published as a graphic novel, I think it's a lot harder, and they're a bit more discerning about who they publish. So usually if you're buying like a bound copy at Barnes and Noble, like that comic is already successful and you're buying like the bound version of it. You're not just buying the singles. So you really have a good bet of finding something good, at least for comics, not for graphic novels, because graphic novels are novels and they usually don't come out in comic form. But anyways, I'll go over a brief summary. Persepolis. I was also waiting for the name drop in Persepolis to come, and I don't think it ever did. Savannah, can you correct me if I'm wrong?
I don't believe that it did.
Yeah, I was very confused. Very confused reading Persepolis. I was reading, waiting for the name drop, trying to understand where this title comes from, and it never came. So we can tell you now, I guess. So Persepolis is an autobiographical graphic novel comic. It did come out in comic installments, as Savannah said before, which I didn't know before. And it is a classic coming-of-age story, but set against the political backdrop of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. I'm not quite sure if the revolution in 1979 is kind of coinciding with the Iraq-Iran war, but it does take place all through that, and you see the after effects of the revolution and the war in the second installment. And it's just about this girl, Marjane, right, the author herself, growing up, learning about other cultures, just so many changes going throughout her country. The big one being kind of the veil that she wasn't forced to wear at the beginning of the school, but now is forced to wear during the Islamic Revolution. Her family's thoughts and sightings and political sightings kind of lining up or not lining up with her own, and it's just her like navigating and finally being sent to Vienna for protection, and she tries to find herself there as she's an adolescent and comes back home eventually to Iran. So that's just generally what the story's about, and it was really moving, really heartwarming. I laughed, I cried, it held all the notes for me, and it was a lot more beautiful than I was expecting, especially when I wasn't super engaged by the paneling and the artwork as much in the beginning. It was a little bit hard for me to get through at the start, but stick through, and the charm of the artwork really did grow on me.
Kind of funny, as an aside, I did watch an interview. No, I read an interview with Marjane Satrapi, and she was saying how people had asked her if the comic was supposed to look like kind of like childish in its drawing, but she was like, no, that's just how bad I draw. Or something to that effect, which I thought was kind of funny.
Oh, and I promised you, Persepolis. It's named after an ancient Persian capital empire, right, Savannah? Is that right? I looked it up.
It's named after the ancient capital of Persia, the Persian Empire.
And just so we can get things out of the way, I know my past self thought of Iran as Arabic and just lumped in together with the Middle East. But they are Persian, they don't speak Arabic, they speak Farsi, and I didn't know that. So just to clear the air there.
And while we will be pretty minimally discussing some of the history of Iran and their revolutions, we are by no means experts or scholars on the very, very expansive history. But I think it's an important history if you've never learned about it, because I certainly didn't learn about that when I was like in high school, and especially within the context of like U.S. Iranian relations today. I highly encourage anybody who doesn't know about it to go educate yourselves on it. And we have lots of sources. We have lots of sources for all of our podcasts in case you're ever interested in any of the things that we're talking about. But for this one, we will also have some sources in our description that you can check out for more information.
But we can get into the nitty gritty. I mean, spoilers all around, but we're not going to do it any kind of justice. Even if you are quote unquote spoiled, it's still 100% worth reading, and our description of it, I don't think would discourage anyone from picking up the book and reading it. But if you would like, you can depart and come back and listen later.
The first thing that I would like to discuss about Persepolis, which is not necessarily the first thing that I took away from it, this is something more that I thought about after reading the books, is viewing Persepolis under the lens of feminism, whether or not we feel like it's a feminist book, what type of feminism it might be looking at, that kind of stuff. So I think it's really important in media that we have examples of women who are not just only from the West. I mean, we've talked about this in many podcasts before about how representation is important. And I think it's particularly important to see representations of women in countries like Iran, to really like see them for who they are. A lot of times with traditional feminism here in the United States or in Europe broadly, it's always from the viewpoint of like white women and what white women need or want, without really recognizing like the needs of women globally. And this is like basically what traditional feminism has always been, with first wave, second wave, third wave feminism, which is just the general way that people describe the different chunks of time and the evolution of feminism from the suffragist movement up through the 90s. That's a bit essentially the time of first, second, third wave feminism. Now we're in fourth wave feminism today. But I think particularly what makes it interesting with Persepolis is the symbol of the veil, like Ryan kind of mentioned earlier, and how Marjane interacts with the veil, being originally living in Iran, not having to wear it. And then as the revolution begins, she does have to start wearing the veil at school and out in public. But it's not as simple as just seeing it as like a symbol of oppression. I think that there is a lot more there to unpack with it.
And just so we can understand what a veil is, they mean kind of like a hair covering that goes over the hairline and down and around the face.
Yeah.
And it can be long or shorter. Unfortunately, it's kind of what you think of, at least what I would think of if I were to think of what it would be like to be oppressed in the Middle East. If I were to think of the women that are over there, my mind, that would... You ever hear that saying, like, you're not responsible for your first thought, but you are responsible for your second thought? So my irresponsible first thought would go to that. My non-thinking brain that's been trained to just associate the Middle East as being all the same and wearing veils.
Yeah, and I mean, that's just how, like I was saying, like, traditionally, even if you grew up in a, like, quote-unquote feminist household, like, traditionally that would be viewed as a sign of oppression. But really, this is just another, like, way of having an Orientalist point of view and, like, othering those people, which has been a major problem with different like feminist organizations or just people who decide to then like go to countries like Iran or other Arab countries where they just like bust in or like, I'm gonna liberate you now and make you like what I think you should be, without actually having a conversation like, hey, maybe there are women there who want to wear it. Maybe there's women there who identify with that. Or even, for instance, I think in Persepolis, Marjane Satrapi does a really good job of kind of like complicating this because of the way that she writes her female characters. Like, I think all of the women in her stories like really are not like passive, like with the things that happen in their life. Like, they're all very active and they're not like feeble, oppressed women. Although like they do sometimes have quite a few like discussions about maybe not liking wearing the veil, or they just don't like that they're forced to wear the veil. But like there's a instance in the beginning of the story where like she first has to wear it to school and her friends are like playing with them. So it kind of like it shows like their agency. Or like there's a scene where when she's a little older, like in college, and her friends are like driving in her car and she like takes it off and they're like screaming and like having fun in their car. And there are some characters that she does interact with who do talk about like wearing the veil. So I think it does a good job of like kind of showing like all of the sides of how people interact with something like that.
If you say so. I think I overall disagree with that. I mean, we both read it. in a higher form of life, I would say. You know, in your 20s, you can think a little bit more broadly. Sure, not as broadly as you think when you're even older, I'm sure, and have read more and consumed more media. I don't know. I consider myself to be not the broadest thinker in the world, just because I know there's so much. And I think if I had read it at a time where I had a smaller brain, like in high school, where I would hope to have read it, I think I would have taken away that the veil is oppressive. I think I would have 100% taken away that message that most women did not want to wear the veil. And maybe that is true, but I do not feel like Satrapi was super clear with that messaging. And even now reading it, like, I know from what I've read, and I know from just learning about intersectional feminism, that the veil is not an oppressive symbol, and women do find comfort and holiness within the veil, whatever they want to find, and it means something to them, while it doesn't to others. But I do not think that Satrapi was clear with that messaging, and I only got that from knowing my prior knowledge.
I think that the women that like are vocal even about not wanting to wear the veil, like those are women even still that like Western feminism would want to go save also. Like it's like Western feminism wouldn't necessarily even have like an understanding of like the complexities that people would have, or that like just basically that people don't need to be saved. Another thing to consider in the context of Persepolis is that it was written in France and came out in French comics originally, and France itself has a problematic, I would say, relationship with the veil right now in the 21st century. France has tried to be a secular society and has banned things like the burqa and the wearing of the veil, while not banning things like wearing crosses, like stuff like that. So it's just very like hypocritical of them, and they're saying it's because they're secular, even though it's just clearly because they're Islamophobic. But so with that, the veil has kind of actually become a form of protest. Like wearing the veil has become a form of protest in France, and Marjane Satrapi has been like asked to speak about all of this quite a bit, and to her, she doesn't really necessarily want to talk about it, but she has said that like to her it's really like all the same thing. Like for her, like growing up in Iran and being told that you have to wear the veil is just as oppressive as being in France and being told that you're not allowed to wear the veil, which I think is interesting. And I think that the novel also speaks to this. There's a really great scene in the movie where she is going to go buy some like bootleg cassette tapes on like the black market, and these women kind of like swarm upon her to like question if she's wearing like punk clothes. And then later when she goes to Vienna and she has to live with the nuns, they like have the exact same imagery of the nuns as they did those other women that like swarmed upon her. And I think that those two scenes were really great because it kind of just shows how it's like all the same bullshit, really. Whether it is Christianity or another religion, like not all, but a lot of religions are oppressive to women, and it seems just more so like we just want to talk about the ones that we feel like are other or we are afraid of versus the ones that we have become like more accepting of, like Christianity.
Yeah, no, totally right. I mean, I'm not a religious person, so watching all of this for me is always kind of like cathartic to be like, see, all the religions, all of them, not great. So I know that's not the takeaway that I'm supposed to get, but that's the takeaway that I get.
With all of this that we've kind of said, Ryan, I do want to ask you, do you feel like Persepolis is a feminist work of literature?
I do. I mean, 100%. Like within the broad definition of feminist or feminism and what it is, I think that most things would fit in that definition of feminism. Yeah, I mean, she is a strong, relatable protagonist that takes us through history. To me, Persepolis was almost like a history book. I learned so many things that I didn't know before and I had to look into, and now that I have an interest for. And this woman really did open up my eyes to a different perspective that made me feel quite small. But in a good way,
I also would consider Persepolis to be a feminist book. Specifically, I am viewing it under the lens of transnational feminism. If you have never heard the term transnational feminism, I will read you the definition. Transnational feminism is how globalization and capitalism affects people across nations, races, genders, classes, and sexualities. This movement asks to critique the ideologies of traditional white, classist Western models of feminist practices from an intersectional approach and how these connect with labor, theoretical applications, and analytical practice on a geopolitical scale. They specifically use transnational rather than international because international puts too much emphasis on nation states, and global speaks more to like liberal feminist theories that don't really acknowledge third world women. And if you've never heard the term intersectional, we've kind of thrown it out a few times already, but to view something through an intersectional lens means that you're viewing kind of like all the different layers of it. So for example, when I first learned about this in school, they had you do like a spider web where it's like you're in the middle of the spider web, and then on each little parts of the spider web are like all the different parts of your identity. So your gender, your race, the class that you come from, what are the points of privilege, what are the points of non-privilege that you have, and how all those things make you up. And you can't really talk about one without talking about all of them at the same time because they're all relevant and all important. And so transnational feminism really holds on to that and like acknowledges things like how the veil might be different for some people, or what specific oppressions somebody are facing in one country are not the same in another country. It really just goes against the idea of kind of like a one size fits all feminism that would apply to everybody in the exact same way. So that's how I view Persepolis particularly. And me personally, if I am calling myself a feminist, I more so would call myself a transnational feminist or an abolitionist feminist. But we can talk about abolition feminism at another time.
What has been your journey with feminism? Like, where did you start? And now, where are you?
Yeah. I feel like most people, when I was young and I heard the word feminism, I like conjured some idea in my head of some like woman who like didn't shave her armpits and was like burning bras and crazy or something. And then in high school, I had a friend who had started calling herself a feminist, and I didn't really understand what she meant by that or why she said that. But really, I owe a lot, I think, to her for really educating me on that. And also my mom. I think my mom really tried her best to teach me about feminism. My mom did minor in women and gender studies in college. And so she I think tried to teach me some things. I mean, okay, backing up more, I feel like I always had women in my life who were feminists in their own way, even if they didn't outwardly say that they were feminists. Anyways, all that is to say, I got to college. I learned a lot on the internet, but I also like started engaging in different activist circles and started taking different classes in the humanities and ended up becoming, what do they say, like a evil feminist witch lady or something. I don't know. And I think it's just continued to evolve from there. And now I'm at a point where I don't even like to necessarily say that I am a just blank feminist, because to me now I feel like that just means white feminist, which means I would just rather say preamble of being a transnationalist feminist or a abolitionist feminist if I'm going to say it at all. What about you, Ryan?
I mean, pretty much not the same. I think I started a bit more at the end of the scale. Like, while you had the bra burning, man-hating, whatever image in your head, I also had that as well. So I outwardly proclaimed that I was an anti-feminist. So it all started there. Anti-feminist. I would consider Republican views, even borderline say I was a Republican.
I almost spit out my drink. Sorry.
It happened. Through college and through the end of high school, I I came to terms with how uneven the word feminist is. And I mean, Tumblr really helped a lot too. Despite how problematic Tumblr is in its own ways, and to use an overused term, problematic, Tumblr really did help open my eyes and give me resources, and kind of pinwheel me forward to the ivory tower of feminism, where I was, I would say, at the pinnacle of sophomore year of college, where I took like 2 big classes and a religion class, and I was really, soaking it all in, being like, I know this. Then junior year came, and that was the year of the 2016 election, and I kind of fell off the ivory tower, and I said, fuck it all, and I haven't looked back since, and I really don't like to look towards the ivory tower for guidance if I can help it. Obviously, I understand the importance of using like terms and communicating with people, but I have been really trying to read and educate myself with real people and real authors, and kind of like you, I'm not super comfortable with branding myself as anything. I mean, I'm a feminist. If I had to say I'm a feminist, of course I'm a feminist, but that's kind of where I am now.
I think that feminism, just like in school, unfortunately, here in the United States, at least in public school, I'm sure there's some like progressive private schools out there, but in public school, to learn about feminism, if you learn about it at all, a lot of it is the same as like some confused ideas that you might get, or not confused, propaganda ideas you might get about somebody like Malcolm X or communism. They like don't really tell you the truth about what things mean. So then you end up having a lot of problematic connotations with them, I think. So
yeah, I mean, I was really lucky in my classes. I felt like they were pretty broad. I learned about feminism from a trans perspective. In one of my classes was taught by a trans woman, and she taught feminism like trans first, which was really insightful. But unfortunately, we had some men in my class that really prevented the conversation from moving forward day to day, and it was horrible.
They really just ruin everything. They really just
they do.
ruin everything.
They act like they're asking some big philosophical questions when the answer is just like, no, that's not how that works.
Yeah, I feel like I've been in many intro-level classes where it just turned into like devil advocates party the whole time. But anyways.
Okay, so I would consider Persepolis a YA novel. I don't know why it's not in the YA section. It is a coming-of-age story, just like Anne Frank Diaries, just like The Book Thief. We get so many Nazi Germany coming-of-age stories in the YA book section. It's ridiculous. I don't know why this one isn't. But anyways, I got 3 wonderful YA little synopsises here. And Savannah, you're going to tell me which one is fake, and 2 of them are real. Here we go. Are you ready, Savannah?
I am ready. All
right. We got Horse of New York. I'm refraining the author's name just because it might be like in the zeitgeist. I don't know. You might pick that up. So a coming-of-age memoir about teen Holly Golding as she relives her childhood of growing up in New York, but this time through the perspective of a horse. We got Rabbit and Robot. This is about a cruise ship that flies over decimated Earth, and robots are starting to malfunction as they have just destroyed the Earth, and 2 human boys are aboard the ship, and they are causing just general mayhem as they try to throw the robots overboard. And I'm not sure what Rabbit has to do with it. I apologize with that one. And then 3, Gideon the Ninth has been described as a murder mystery in space. But this time it's with lesbian necromancers. So tell me, which of these 3 is a truth and a lie? Is it Gideon the Ninth, Rabbit and Robot, or Horse of New York?
I feel like I don't know. I want the one that I want to pick. I feel like I want to pick the necromancy lesbians, but I'm pretty sure that the last time the lie was the last answer, so I feel like you would switch it up, but maybe you wouldn't switch it up to like further confuse me. I'm gonna go with the necromancy lesbians. They're the lie.
Final answer?
Yes.
And you are wrong. Gideon the Ninth is real. Written by Tamsin Muir. I personally read it about 2 weeks ago, and it was lovely. It was so good, Savannah. Do you know what I just said? Lesbian necromancers in space, murder mystery? Like, it's so good.
I mean, that sounds great. I wouldn't want it to be a lie.
I know. It just sounded too good to be true, but it actually exists. The lie was Horse of New York, which I thought was just so real sounding that it didn't exist.
It really, because like horse girls are a thing. Like, it made sense. Well, you got me with that one. So the next thing that we are going to talk about with Persepolis is how the story represents the West and Western culture. So to start off, just a little bit of background. In Persepolis, Marjane, she does attend a French school. Her family is middle class, and they do seem to have quite a bit of influence of Western culture. I believe they do show how they get like satellite TV so they can watch TV from like other countries and things like that. And they show right off the bat, like Marjane is very interested not only in Western icons like Bruce Lee, but she also is really interested in like Western philosophers as well. And this is like a big part of her identity in a way, is like all of these Western things that she's really fascinated by. But I think the story really shows kind of her like disillusionment in a way with Western things as it progresses, and she eventually like moves to Europe. And Europe and America are kind of seen as being like, well, first of all, a lot of kids like Marjane are sent to these countries for their own safety during the Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War. So it is viewed as like a safe haven, these places, but also just kind of viewed as being like the place where there's democracy or the place,
freedom,
all those
liberty,
or the place of like being able to experience life in a non-oppressive way. But that really ends up not being the case, and she experiences that firsthand, which while I said, like, I think that the book and the movie do a good job of doing that, but kind of interestingly, I saw a trailer for when the movie came out, and the trailer kind of presented, like, the opposite, which I thought was kind of strange, and I wondered if they did that to try to, like, get more people on board with seeing this movie, because the trailer that I saw, like, it shows her, like, having her life in Iran and then moving to Vienna, and then it just kind of, like, cuts there on, like, a really happy moment, as if, like, her life is just perfect and happy when she moved to Vienna, which I thought was a strange choice. But again, they probably just did that because that might be easier to sell to people here in the United States or in Europe.
I didn't watch the trailer, so I wouldn't know about that. I did get the feeling of disillusionment with Western culture, and I feel like I could identify with that in a much lesser way, because I had such a great aversiveness to Mexican culture growing up. I did not appreciate it like I do now, and I gravitated towards more like normal white people things. And now I feel myself kind of going back the other way, seeing that same disillusion that she did, and seeing kind of like the hominess and comfort with your own culture and practices.
I think I've definitely had a similar journey with that and have felt same way, or at least close to how you felt. It's also interesting that she chooses to highlight this in the story, because feeling too much of an influence of the West was actually one of the things that led up to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The people there were feeling like they were essentially losing their Persian identity, amongst a lot of other problems or issues that they were facing that was leading to the revolution, but that was one of them that led to that, and feeling like they were having kind of like American culture and ideals like pushed onto them.
But at the time when reading the book from Marjane's perspective, it didn't feel like that was one of the main reasons that was hammered into the book. It felt more political as to why the uprising occurred, which I mean I'm sure is for the most part true, but also I mean there is that a lot of sentiments that can be mixed in, but that wasn't one that I got from the book itself.
Yeah, I would agree. I did not necessarily get that from reading the book. I just learned that as a fact afterwards, and then I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting as a parallel there. But the book does talk about the influence of like the US and British involvement in Iran and how they really contributed to the 1979 revolution, and contributed to the hardships that people were facing during the Iran-Iraq War, which again, I think was done both because that's just historically what happened, and the book does a lot of historical background, but also I think that really highlights the nature of just the story of like disillusionment and realizing that the West is not going to save you. Basically, like in the movie, like there is a line at the end where they say like they realized that the West was selling bombs to both Iran and Iraq at the same time. And I've heard quite a bit of other people who are Iranian who have talked about living through that war and the revolution and saying how really like one of the biggest things that was so hard for them were the sanctions that they faced from the United States, and still sanctions today from the United States, and having to deal with that. Like they show lots of scenes in the book and the movie of like her going to the grocery store and them not having food, and things like that. And it also highlights quite a bit just the reality of how the US and British involvement was just really due to the extractivism of oil and wanting to have control over that there. Which again, I think is important to know and learn about, especially in the context of people talking about US-Iran relations today. Also with this, Marjane Satrapi has said that she does not necessarily write for any particular audience in mind, and that's just talking about her widely. She's written other books. With her other books, she doesn't particularly write with a audience in mind, but with Persepolis in particular, she did want to write it for people who didn't have an understanding of Iran or Persian culture or any of those things because of her experience of going to Vienna and being really like ostracized by people and people being racist towards her. So that's why she wanted to write it, and it was written for a Western audience to learn about these things.
Yeah, and in the foreword, she specifically states that she does not want Iranian people to be viewed from the perspective of a few fundamentalists, and she gives a brief synopsis of the history before the Shah, which was the regime before the 1979 Islamic Revolution. So that whole preamble I greatly needed. There was a lot of history lessons in the beginning, and it was a bit hard for me to get through all those history lessons in the beginning, but she did make it palatable, and I did get through it, and I am a lot more educated for it. So I appreciate her catering to my Western brain, even though we're probably undeserving.
And I think it's really great to consider Persepolis within the context of just, like I was saying, like just needing broader representation, like we were talking about in our previous podcast with Raya and the Last Dragon, and how like there's been stories such as like Aladdin that have a very Orientalist point of view, that just really reinforce awful stereotypes of people, and Persepolis does not do that, and that is one of the great things that can happen when you do have an actual person of that culture writing a story about their culture and sharing it with the world.
Well, moving on from that, I mentioned before that I feel like Persepolis is a young adult novel. It should be in the young adult section. I feel it should be taught in schools. Do you feel the same way, Savanah?
Oh yeah, I definitely think it should be taught in schools. I have seen there's a teacher that I follow on YouTube, and he's talked about how he teaches it, I believe, in maybe his like sophomore English class or something like that. I think it would be incredible either to teach it in an English class or a history class. I mean, I feel like we had a very strange, I feel like we just went to a strange high school sometimes that just had like...
Me too.
I just had like a lot of stuff going on, because while we lived in a very like conservative town with like generally conservative curriculum, I think Ryan and I had the benefit of having some teachers who just like didn't care and were just gonna like teach what they wanted to anyways sometimes. So I'm grateful for those teachers, but like I remember like in our English classes, I don't know about you, Ryan, but a lot of times there would be books that we would read, And our teachers would, one, like sometimes we'd have to sign a permission slip or get a permission slip to sign to read those books. Or you would be given like another option to read something else.
It was always the Joy Luck Club. Every time. It was always the Joy Luck Club.
It was. And when I go back and think about the books that they made us do that with, it just makes me like so upset. Like I remember, the ones that I remember particularly were Bless Me Ultima, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And looking back, I just reread that recently, and looking back and thinking about how they made some kids like just weren't allowed to read it. I'm just like, what the fuck? Like what? Why? Because there's Mexicans in it? I don't understand. And then the second one that caused a huge uproar was reading Toni Morrison's Beloved in high school as well. Oh my God. There was this one girl in the class, Ryan. It was too much. People being like they just couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle Toni Morrison. So I could see how it would be hard to get Persepolis into school. I don't think that our school probably would have allowed it unless a teacher like really fought for it. What do you think?
Yeah, I just think with the Persepolis in particular, I think the main argument against it would probably be the violence. And to my point, I say, what about every single piece of German history and World War II history that's just always there? Because it's always the most interesting to teach, or at least I feel like when we get to the World War II unit, there's always like some hype, you know, like we're going to talk about the real stuff, war, death, concentration camps. And it did feel like kind of an event. It was always like a 2-week world history or World War II kind of event. And with this, I mean, there's a whole other thing in like glorifying war and treating the history of World War II like an event to get to in history classes. Whole other subject. But I mean, Night we were allowed to read in junior high. Anne Frank we were allowed to read in junior high. The Book Thief is now really put up on a pedestal. And all of those have depictions of death and violence in it. And I'm just not quite sure why this one wouldn't be considered. I mean, we know why. It's not white. I think that as progressive as our school was, it was Islamophobic. I mean, we had zero representation, I would say, about cultures of the Middle East, except for, I would say, my world history. I think they did a pretty primo job telling me about world history in the Middle East. However, it's not really taught on AP history exams. So when we go over it, it's not reinforced in our brains because they're not going to ask us questions about that.
But yeah, no, I totally agree. I had this also on the outline. I was thinking about these same things, like why are some things like Diary of Anne Frank okay, or To Kill a Mockingbird okay, but Persepolis wouldn't be okay, even when, like, I remember reading Night in school and there being some pretty graphic scenes in that kind of like, I didn't like hearing or reading as a like 12-year-old. But I mean, it's just because people are Islamophobic. That's just what it is.
And even if the argument was the adult themes of like the second book with drinking and drugs and sex and whatnot, you could just teach the first book. I think the first book is just as impactful on its own. And if a kiddo really wanted to continue the story, they could read the second book on their own. So even if that's the argument, there's no reason whatsoever to not teach the first book as a standalone.
Going off in a different direction, something else that Persepolis talks about, like in the narrative of the story, is kind of like this indoctrination of the youth and how they show them like at school having to like beat their chests for the martyrs, and talking about like the young boys being given keys so that way if they join the army and they die, they'll have a key to get into heaven. And even in the very beginning of the story, Marjane, when she's talking to her parents, like she is supportive of the Shah because that's what she learned in school. Like they taught her that the Shah is the person to idolize. And also that like religion in that same vein should be idolized. And I think it's easy, just as we've talked about with having Orientalist perspective, to view that as being like, oh, that is horrible and oppressive, and that's why we have separation of church and state here in the United States. But I would argue that we have just as much indoctrination in our public schools. I can think of some like examples that I have in my mind, Ryan. I'm curious to know like if you have felt indoctrinated. I'm sure you have, or any particular examples of that you have that you maybe could have related to with Marjane in that vein.
Yeah, I mean, I have. I think going to a Girl Scout camp and talking to like international employees, like specifically people from like Holland and England, like no one else is required to say the national anthem in the morning. No one else is required to remember like however many sentences of the Constitution. No one else is required to, you know, like the list goes on and on and on and on. And everyone knows about Christianity, right? Everyone does. Do you have like a specific like striking example in mind, Savanah?
Yeah. I think I have a few, specifically like post 9/11 and the war on terror. I remember being in school and like having that be a lot of what we talked about, or like activities. Like I remember they would make us write letters to soldiers, and there was like different like fundraising events and lots of things about like wearing a little flag pin on your clothes. And I don't know, I feel like I just remember a lot of my teachers like talking about the war on terror or the war in Iraq from a very like nationalistic point of view. And it's actually really funny. I've found some like photographs and yearbooks and things from this particular period of time in my life, and there's just like this really funny like class photo, I think, of when I was in like the first or second grade, where we're just all in the library and there's just like this big picture of George W. Bush in the background of our class photo, or even in our yearbooks that came out that year. There's just like this whole, like, it's really funny. It's like a whole section, like we have our pictures, and then there's like a section on American Idol, and then there's a section on the war on terror, like in my like first grade yearbook. And I don't know why that had to be there. Well, I know why it had to be there, to indoctrinate us youth into having nationalistic points of view, but also just like the presence of the military and the police state on our school campuses, I think, was always very high, with just like people trying to recruit students into joining the military after high school, or the people, I forget what they're called, that did stuff.
ROTC.
Yeah, ROTC, and then the presence of police officers on campus as well. And just like kind of said before, like the general curriculum that very, very minorly ever talked about things from a non-Western perspective, and just most of our history books being propaganda. All of that is to say, when I was like re-watching and studying back up on Persepolis this time, I felt like I related to Marjane in that sense, because I feel like I remember like saying some of the things maybe that I had learned in school or had seen on TV to my parents, and them being like, what? Like, why are you saying this? Like, why do you suddenly love the president? And it would be because of things like that. Or I remember having a conversation later of being like on the other side of things with one of our cousins, Ryan, when I was probably in like the third grade, and saying I hated George W. Bush, and then our cousin was like, how dare you say that about the president? Anyways, I just felt like I really identified with that part of the story this time around.
Yeah, I also wanted to bring that up. I completely forgot I wanted to talk about that in our little outline here. I loved the modeling that she did, right? Like, she heard like one thing, she would echo it somewhere else, she would hear another thing, she would bring it back to school, back and forth, and that was really relatable, and I really enjoyed seeing it so well portrayed in written form, because I feel like a lot of people, when I read stories about younger people, they don't talk about that, like, and they don't want to make them seem like they're like dumb and like all they can do is repeat, but that's how children are. You read one thing from one source and you feel like you know it all, and that's how some people stay.
Yeah, and it wasn't even just like the things that she heard at school or that she would interact with, but also just like her family, like they talk a lot about how Marjane's family in particular were people who were revolutionaries or against the government, and she really like took that on as like being a part of herself, and then would kind of lose that and then come back to it. So I agree. I think it was a really interesting and good job of showing modeling in that way for adolescents.
Yeah, it was quite charming. I loved it. One thing I didn't love as much though, I loved everything in the comic books. Every panel I feel like was really well done. I feel like the flow was really easy to read. But that movie, man, why was it so choppy, Savannah? Why was it so choppy?
What do you mean by choppy?
They did this thing where they would get through certain scenes and they would fade to black and they would fade back in and they would fade to black and they would fade back in, like scene through scene. And I didn't like that. And I feel like it was very hard to understand if you did not read the source material. In fact, I do know it was very hard to understand because I watched it with my cis white hetero boyfriend, and he came away with just kind of a general understanding, not having read the source material.
Yeah, I noticed that also when I was rewatching the movie this time. And I wonder if they did that to try to like emulate the comics, I guess, like the experience of like having one comic, ending the comic, starting another one, ending the other one, or just trying to like, there's quite a few panels in the comic that are like almost primarily black, so maybe that was what it was. But I do agree. I mean, just like so many other books, like there's so much information in it that I think it's just impossible to condense it all down into a less than 2-hour movie. The thing that I don't necessarily like as much about the movie is like the juxtaposition of the black and white and the color, and having it being
I didn't like that
she's
either.
like looking back on everything from the color perspective. I would have just preferred it to just be like black and white without like the reminiscing part of it.
Yeah, I understood the choice. I didn't agree with it. It was an odd film, especially if it was supposed to be targeted towards children, which I'm not sure it was.
Yeah, I don't think it was.
It was very hard to understand. Where the comics, where you were able to slow down, breathe, and reread panels, I was not able to do this with the film. And they even kind of changed some history aspects of it in the beginning. Like the Shah was completely explained differently in the comic versus in the movie, which I thought was kind of strange. It was a lot more simplified, which, I mean, it's simplified for a movie, right? It's easier to digest, but it was just kind of weird.
Honestly, I feel like if it were to be taught in school, it would be more effective to just teach maybe the first book and not just like the movie, unless like, I don't know, I feel like that was always fun in school when we read a book and then watched the movie afterwards. But I do not think that teachers should rely upon just the movie for teaching it in school. Although, like, I don't dislike the movie. Like, if you're a person who's listening to this and has an interest but doesn't have interest in reading the books, I would encourage you to still watch the movie because it isn't, like, awful, in my opinion. I just think that the graphic novels were more effective in both capturing like the memoir aspect of it, but also just like the historical nature and the coming of age story.
Beautifully animated, very it translated really well, the animation style and the cartoon style, from the book to the movie. But other than that, I didn't really see a point to it unless it was supposed to be something that was easier to digest and like show off and show the story into a different medium, but I don't think it did that very successfully, in my opinion. And I still think that Ratatouille should have won over this picture. End of story.
Marjane Satrapi, I did see in an interview, she did say that she didn't really want to make the movie, that she had a friend. She was friends with the other director and friends with the person who wanted to produce it, and she just was like, okay, I'll do it because you're my friend, basically. But she didn't really want to do it, and she even said in this interview that she didn't think it would be effective. But I think that's just kind of sometimes what happens when something is like so widely successful, like it just ends up happening because people want to make more money off of it, maybe. I don't know.
General thoughts?
So, general thoughts. Yeah, like I said before, I really love Persepolis. I think it was an instant classic. I think that everybody should read it. Watch the movie if you're not into graphic novels, but I'd really encourage you to read the graphic novel. Persepolis was really, I think, my introduction to learning about Iranian history, which really like opened my eyes to a lot that I didn't know about before. I never knew about the atrocities of the Iran-Iraq War, and it was just mind-blowing to me that I never learned about that in school anywhere. And it really kind of developed like a deep interest in me, I guess, for Iranian and Persian history. And one of my favorite artists that I would recommend you check out, who's also a director who makes some work that is pretty in line with Persepolis, her name is Shirin Nishat. And she's an Iranian photographer and director who has a couple movies, and I really love her work. So if you like Persepolis, I recommend you check her out as well. I also really love Marjane Satrapi's other graphic novel, Embroideries, where she talks about the women in her life in particular, and that story is also really great as well. What about you, Ryan? General wrap-up thoughts.
Loved it, loved it, loved it. 10 out of 10. You were so right when you said instant classic. That book will never be dated. I think that book will always survive to like test of time. Mandatory reading in all classrooms. Yeah. So sometimes I'm like, should I become a teacher just so I can, liberalize everyone?
That whenever I've been a teacher, that's just been my goal. Thanks everybody for sticking with us through this story of Persepolis. Go out, celebrate Women's History Month, buy something from a woman, give her some money.
At the very least, please like and subscribe to this video. You would be supporting us, two women. Thank you.
Yes. And just to tell you about our giveaway, even more incentive to do this. So again, just like we said with our last podcast, we have an ongoing giveaway where really it's not even a contest. If you participate, you will likely get something. So to get a special Pokemon card that is a reading of your aura by yours truly, Ryan, all you have to do is review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on Instagram. Screenshot these things and either email them to us. Our email is in our description, or you can DM us on Instagram and we will send you a Pokemon card that represents your true aura and personality. If you're not an Instagram person and you just listen to podcasts, all you have to do is leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and email us. Just don't even worry about the Instagram thing, and you will get your very own special Pokemon card. We will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.